Number 1. The Cave. I never liked really hanging out with a bunch of other people. Not even when I was young. I was into things like astronomy, trivia, nature, and things like that. I was one of the quiet kids who were in school. No one ever picked on me or gave me a hard time. I mean, I could walk the hallways and be quiet. That was just me. Being like that, I often liked to go for walks in nature. It was so easy to just be alone, and the feeling of isolation from people was something I liked very much. My parents used to joke that when I grew up, I would become a hermit. There was a lot of rural area around where I grew up. Most of the area I had explored at some point when I was younger. When I was 16 and had a truck, I would drive to new places and explore them too. That opened up a new world for me because it gave me so many new places to see. It was when I was going to one of these new places that I had a very scary thing happen to me. I was driving my truck. It was a very small Isuzu that was rusted in many places, but I liked it. It was comfortable, and I never felt bad parking it on the side of the road with the windows down when I found somewhere to go and explore. This was such a breezy day. The wind had to be like over 20 miles per hour. I liked it. I was driving down a dirt road with a wooden fence blocking off a large field. I wasn't very interested in that. I wanted to find something with trees and stuff like that. I finally found a place on a hill that I felt I could park my truck at. I was able to get it off the road, but it could still be seen by anybody who was driving up or down on the hill. There was no fence or anything like that on the road. In fact, there was no barrier between the road and the edge of the hill. There would be nothing keeping you from just falling off if you accidentally drove off the side. But that's not the way I was going. I climbed up onto the hill. It was a pretty big hill, and I knew that I would be having a lot of fun this day. I did see a lot of new and interesting things, and I was so enwrapped by all of the new scenery that I lost track of time. I just kept exploring deeper and deeper into the woods, and I wasn't worried about my truck or getting lost or anything. The wind was very strong, like I mentioned, and a few times as it blew through the branches of the trees, I thought I heard things. It can be very creepy, especially when you were all by yourself. At one point, I found this creek, and I decided to follow it for a while. I was glad I did because it led me to one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. I eventually came up into a rocky area that had a waterfall on the very far end of it. And it wasn't that large, but the first thing I thought about was it looked like a miniature canyon, almost like a model of a canyon, and it was really great. So the walls were rocky and the creek flowed through it, but there was ample rocks to walk on and explore. I was walking along the creek. I was careful not to step in it and get my feet wet because, honestly, that was something I really hated, wet feet. But a lot of the flat rocks I were walking on were pretty slippery, and I did see quite a few salamanders though, and I really enjoyed watching them. I had been out for a long time at this point, and I guess the sun had been traveling down to the horizon. It wasn't going to be dark quite yet, but I knew I would not have a lot of time after exploring this little area. I would probably be going back in the dark for a little bit, but that didn't bother me, and I had often done it. Plus, I had a flashlight with me. As I was exploring and the wind was blowing, I thought that I heard what sounded like a stressed moan coming from up ahead of me. I was put off for just a moment, as anyone would be, but I immediately dismissed the moan as something that I just got confused because it was something in the wind. I was still walking up to the waterfall. As I got closer, and closer. I heard a few more really weird sounds. It was not so easy to always dismiss it as the wind, though, because it sounded like it was coming from an animal, or something like that. Just that alone made me nervous as hell. But as anyone does in those situations, I kept telling myself that it was all in my head. When I got closer to the waterfall, I noticed something off to my right side. I mentioned before that the area I was walking through was rocky, like a miniature canyon. Well, I noticed that there was a cave off to the right side of me, and when I noticed it, I heard that moaning sound again. I felt really nervous as I began getting really close to the opening of the cave. I remained on the left side of the creek, though. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was absolutely scared and nervous. I heard some more talking that sounded like words, and I finally was standing at the side of the creek across from the cave. It caught my attention a lot more than the waterfall at this point. As I peered into the cave, I felt a shock as someone or some form of someone or something emerged from the cave. I mean, it was obviously a person, but the strangest, most ragged-looking person I'd ever seen. He was pale and extremely skinny. His beard and hair were long and tangled. His clothing was tattered, and his skin was white and cracked. But the two things that caught my attention the most were the crazy look in his eyes and the knife he held in his right hand. The man came out of the cave and was coming right toward me. He started crossing the creek, splashing the water hard with every single step. Fortunately for me, this made it difficult for him to get across the creek very quickly. I was able to gather my bearings and realize I was in danger. It was so odd. The guy was obviously after me. He was revolting looking, and he had a knife, but the whole thing was so absolutely bizarre that I first could not take my eyes off it. Finally, I realized I needed to get out of there. I turned and started running back down the way that I had come in the miniature canyon. The first time I looked back, I saw the weirdest thing. Rather than coming all the way across the creek, he was still in the middle of the creek. But this time, he was still running down the creek toward me. It was so strange because it was so inefficient and weird. And that just scared me more because that made it seem like his mental state was something I wanted nothing to do with. I could hear him yelling at me. Mostly I was able to make out that he wanted me to get out of there. And I was complying. I was absolutely terrified, and I was on autopilot getting out of there. I don't think he followed me once I got away from that area. I looked back a few times and didn't see him. After a while I stopped hurrying when I could figure out that he was not chasing me. I got back to my truck after a few hours. I'd been shaken up though. Even as I got home, I kept expecting to have him jump out of the bed of the truck and grab me, or something like that. But that was just a normal reaction after having a scare like that. When I got home, I told my dad about what happened. I expected him to call me crazy or think that I was lying. But he told me that I had to be careful with those long hikes of mine. He told me there were hermits and other sorts who live off the grid, perhaps in caves, huts, or stuff like that. They are very possessive about their property, and it was possible that he would have killed me if he had to. Chilling words, but I never forgot them. It didn't stop me from hiking in the future, though. I never had quite a scary experience like that again. Number 2. Scary stories. During the summertime when I was younger, I would spend at least a month and a half staying out in the country with my aunt's family. My cousin was a couple years younger than me, but we always had a lot of the same interests and got along together. My aunt lived in a very beautiful area out in the country. I grew up in a city, so I always enjoyed everything about going out to visit them. When I was 10, I lived with them for about a year and just fell in love with it, so the visiting became a regular thing. My cousin Philip and I had a lot in common, like I'd mentioned. He and my uncle picked me up in town at the bus drop-off. The two of us rode in the open bed of my uncle's pickup truck, while my uncle and aunt were up in the front. I remember this day very vividly. It was very bright outside. It was warm, sunny, and there was a pleasant breeze going too. We both had bottles of Stewart's root beer, and we pretended like they were real beers as we drove along. It was just something we did back then. The ride to the house was about an hour-long ride, all through the country. I always liked it when we got out into the hills and watched all the beautiful trees swaying in the breeze. And I was so excited, knowing what was going to be coming up in the upcoming months. There were no houses that were really close to my aunt's house. My aunt's house was at the foot of a holler, and across the road from fields that we usually used to play baseball. The next closest house was a minimum of a 15-minute car drive, and although Philip and I did walk there one time, I can't recall how long it actually took for us to make it the entire way. We did a lot of the normal things that we did back then, played ball, explored, went to the pool in town, many things of that nature. This was in the late 1980s, and they definitely were not able to have things like cable out in that area, and the house was very old, and thus obviously without air conditioning. But that was okay because we spent a whole lot of time outside anyway. Philip and I, one night, decided that we were going to set up a tent way back in the holler in order to tell each other scary stories, away from the safety of the house. I mean, we didn't tell my aunt and uncle that was the reason, because they never really cared for that sort of thing. We had gone back to the house to have supper. We waited until it was dark, though, in order to go back out to the tent. I'll never forget what it was like, simply walking in the dark, far back in the holler like that. We had one of those cheap plastic flashlights, but that could make things seem scarier than not having a light at all, since they were so weak. Anyway, we had a good night out there for the most part. And yeah, we told some scary stories, which might explain afterward why we were pretty scared and worked up. There was absolutely no light in that holler, other than our weak flashlight. Late in the night, I have no way of knowing what time it actually was, we started hearing something. It sounded like someone or something was walking around in that area that we had put the tent in. Philip quickly turned out the flashlight and told me to listen. I always found that odd because he seemed to think that I couldn't listen if the flashlight was on, but that's not really important to know. We did hear something. We began whispering to each other, trying to wonder what it might be. It was obviously someone who was very large by the way they were moving about. Even though the two of us had our heads filled with scary stories already, we didn't immediately think it could be a person. We thought it was probably some kind of animal. And of course, that didn't make it any less frightening. And we kept listening and whispering. It seemed like whatever it was happened to be walking back and forth behind our tent. Like it would get to one side, stop, and then slowly walk back behind the tent to the other side. This went on for a few moments, and the two of us began to get very, very scared. And we kept whispering, wondering what we should do. I wanted to get out of the tent and run to the house, but Philip thought it would be better if we just pretended we weren't aware of what was going on out there. I really didn't understand that, but I guess I can get why he might think running would get us chased. The decision was made for us, though. We heard this strange cackling noise, and something suddenly started shaking the tent. I mean, it was surreal, like something out of a scary movie. The cackle made us think of a witch or something like that, and we were lucky we didn't crap ourselves right then. Despite his original fear of just running, Philip and I bolted from the tent. We both ran faster than we'd ever run before, and probably ever has since. It was intense, running and trying to get away. You know, you always hear about people looking back when they are running away from something they're scared of. Neither of us did that. We didn't want to know whatever the hell it was that could laugh like that, and would be hanging out in a holler, waiting to scare a couple kids. When we got back to the door, which was unlocked like it always was, but once we got inside, we locked it. My uncle came out and asked what was going on, and we explained it as best we could, and pleaded with him to lock all the doors, something they never did. Philip's dad was a big old country boy. He was 6'4" tall, and a known barroom brawler type. He absolutely was not going to lock the doors. He went out in the holler with a better flashlight to check it out and see what was going on. Philip and I were terrified as we waited for him to come back. It took quite a while, but eventually he did, and we were worried about it taking so long and thought that the witch or whoever was out there had gotten him. But he came back and told us there was nothing there. Needless to mention, we didn't sleep back out in that tent that night. A few years later, my parents got divorced and I went to live with my mom. These were my dad's family, so we fell out of touch. I mention this because I reflect back on this story. I don't really look at it as Philip and I were attacked by a witch or something like that. Honestly, I think that Philip's dad probably had one of his buddies come over, and they were just trying to scare us. It would explain why he was gone for so long when he was checking the holler out, because they would have been talking and probably laughing about their joke. But I don't know for sure. I guess I could ask. They're all still alive. But honestly, I don't want to know. I kinda like the ambiguity of being scared. Number 3. Camping. The last time I went camping was over 30 years ago. It used to be one of my favorite things to do, but after what happened to me and my friend Jeff on that trip, I could never imagine going on another camping trip ever again. Hey, I'm Alvin, and yes, that is really my name. I wasn't named after the chipmunk either, so let's just get that out of the way. Jeff and I both enjoyed camping, but we weren't like some people who loved living off the land and knew everything about nature. We liked having our conveniences that made it easier to live out there. We were both 22 years old when we went on this trip. We had both just graduated from college and wanted to have some fun before going off to work, and I was going to go to grad school. We always put out a camp, and were very careful when tending to the fire. We also slept in separate tents. The tents were always right beside each other, though. We'd often talk through the tents when we were in our sleeping bags, much like we might have done if we were having a sleepover as kids. We had been out on this trip for about 4 days. We didn't do a lot of hiking. Once we set up our camp, we stayed at that camp. There was a small stream and a pond that were not too far away, and we fished in that. We had talked for a little while until we drifted off that night, never really knowing who it was that fell asleep first. Being woken up from a deep sleep is very disorientating, and not only that, but I had noticed that my tent flap was open, and I saw someone I did not know, which could not have been Jeff, who was looking in my tent. I was going to panic and react, but he quickly showed me that he had a gun. He told me that if I didn't do what he told me to, he would not hesitate to kill me, but if I listened to him, I would live through it. I was too scared to move and decided that I would go ahead and do as I was told. I was worried about Jeff, but I really did not want to comment on it. I didn't know what might have happened or what might eventually happen. He made me get out of my sleeping bag and lay face down on the ground. He then tied my hands behind my back and tied my feet together. And this whole time I was terrified beyond belief. I was scared to let the guy tie me up, because who knew if that was going to be the end of it. I heard him moving around our camp, going through our stuff for a while, and then after a while of doing that, he took off. He left Jeff and I tied up, which was a real pain because We didn't know how we were going to get up, but at least he hadn't hurt us in any way. Jeff eventually managed to get one of his hands free, although he bloodied it up pretty badly doing that. But fortunately, he was able to get all free and then get me free. Not wanting to take any chances that the guy could come back, we tried to pack what was left in our camp and get out of there. We didn't actually have a whole lot left, as the guy took nearly everything. But we took what was left, and made our way out of the forest area. We had to call and get some money wired to us so we could hire a locksmith to get a new key for our car. It was a nightmare, but at least we were alive. I'm thankful I'm alive, but I've relived that scary experience over and over since, and I've never been brave enough to ever go camping again. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. Just want to talk about what's going on here. Things got kind of thrown off schedule last week, and I'm sorry about that, but now we are on schedule. This video should be posted early Tuesday morning. This coming Friday, I plan on posting another 10 new 2-sentence horror stories, and then on Sunday, we will have another 3 scary story video coming out. I really want to keep to the Tuesday, Friday, Sunday schedule, and I'm hoping my OCD will keep me doing this. I just want to thank everyone for your patience, and I really hope that you enjoy the many new stories that'll be coming out. But also, if you're not subscribed, please hit the subscribe button and the bell, which will tell you when new videos will come out, but you guys know that because you're on YouTube. Like the video and share it if you think somebody else might enjoy it. In the meantime, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where the Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.